Hello, I'm delighted to have Dr. Marjan join our podcast today. Dr. Ma has been a pioneer in sustainable green finance for a long time. By way of a brief background to Dr. Ma, he has an incredibly impressive CV. Some of the highlights include he is president of the Institute of Finance and Sustainability, IFS, the founder of the Capacity Building Alliance for Sustainable Investment, CASI, which we'll hear more about, and the former co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. During our conversation, we'll cover Dr. Ma's pioneering work in sustainable finance, the role of CASI, and the future of sustainable investing in emerging market and developing economies. Just by way of introduction, Dr. Ma, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your career journey and how you became focused on sustainable finance, green finance.
Thank you very much, Paul, for inviting me to join this conversation. As you know, I started my career as a macroeconomist. I initially worked at the World Bank and IMF, that's in the 1990s, as the senior economist. Then I moved on to the investment banking sector. I spent 13 years with Deutsche Bank from 2000 to 2014 as chief economist for the Greater China region. So really at the end of my Deutsche Bank career, I began to convert myself from an economist to a green finance advocate. The trigger was in 2013. I remember that was January. I think it's 13th of January, 2013, very, very cold time in Beijing. I was hosting a conference on behalf of Deutsche Bank for our clients. We have lots of international investors sitting in the five-star hotel. I think it's a Grand Hyatt hotel. But funnily, when I was speaking to these clients, I realized that a lot of people were coughing. And at some point, their coughing was louder than my voice. So I tried to figure out what was happening. And that evening, I was told that the PM 2.5, which is the air pollution index in China, went up to 1,000.
Wow.
For those of you who are not familiar with PM 2.5, the safe level is 25, according to WHO. And that time in Beijing, it was 1,000. So the entire Beijing city was like a smoke room in airport. And visibility is probably only 10, 20 meters on the street. So that was something really triggered my sort of rethinking about the financial system because we were allocating so much financial resources to different industries. And most of them at that time were polluting. For example, coal-fired power generation, steel, cement, petrochemical, and so on. All of them were making so much money, but they were polluting. And this essentially means that the allocation function of financial system was wrong because of channeling the resources to the unsustainable activities. And we have to do something really to fix these problems. So it was the beginning of my sort of rethinking of what we should do within the financial system. So I had opportunity in 2014 to join the central bank in China, which is the People's Bank of China, as chief economist. And almost immediately after I joined the central bank, I put together a task force on green finance. I think that was August 2014 to begin a study on how to establish a green financial system in China. So within 3 months, with a lot of inputs from domestic, international experts, in fact, we received a lot of help from international experts, including from UNEP and those in UK, EU, and the US on the international experience for green finance. And we formed 14 recommendations on the basis of many of these domestic international recommendations submitted to the central government. Very quickly, these recommendations were adopted. So they became a key decision in the central government's document called Eco-Civilization Plan. That was, I think, in September 2015, which became the basis of the Chinese green finance guideline. So really, in the second half of 2015 and the first half of 2016, I spent most of my time working on organizing the drafting of the green finance guideline in China. We had inputs from 7 ministries, so it was a fairly significant task, spending a year on this guideline, and by August 2016, this was published. We can proudly say that this was the first top-down green finance policy framework in the world. It's an official one. Of course, many other countries had probably suggestions, private sector initiative, and so on, but this is the first top-down central government-led green finance guideline. And 8 years later, if we look back under the guidelines, we are now having the largest green lending market and the largest green bond market. So Chinese green lending market is now 36 trillion RMB outstanding, which is about 5 trillion US dollar. And our green bond market, in terms of outstanding amount, is 2.2 trillion RMB. And what this green finance do really to the economy, it was supporting the massive growth of the green industry, such as renewables, EVs, and batteries. In fact, the last few years, the renewable capacity installation in China represents 50% of the global total. The EV production in China represents 60% of the global total, and 70% of batteries produced in the world are from China. So behind all of that are the green financial instruments, green loans, green bonds, green PEs, and so on. So that was a domestic effort, but I also spent a lot of time, especially starting from 2016, working on international initiatives, including, as you mentioned, I've been co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, and also I co-chaired a lot of bilateral initiatives, including China, UK, China, Europe, China, Singapore, collaborations on green finance. And more recently, namely 2013, we launched this CASI program, which is the capacity building platform for emerging markets, developing economies.
I was struck by your comment when you were talking about the pollution in Beijing and how much that's actually changed. As you know, I have the pleasure of visiting Beijing quite frequently, and I'd heard a lot about air quality. But one thing that struck me is just the use of electric vehicles, the amount of cars that are using electric vehicles, and also how the psychology of every person I speak to, whether it's across academics or within firms, or individuals, of the importance of sustainability. So it's great to see how that has sort of manifested itself into really the fabric of everyday life there. And I just wanted to touch a little bit deeper in terms of understanding your experience as a co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, and how what you feel that achieved at the time, and how that sort of influenced your thinking on a look-forward basis.
Yeah, working on international platform such as G20 is very different compared with the domestic work. Domestically, it was easier in the sense that we had very strong will from a central government to support initiatives such as the green finance. So we could easily coordinate different ministries and financial industries in a way that can move things very fast. But internationally, the G20 works on a consensus basis, which means that for every piece of deliverable, whether it's a framework or it's policy guidelines or it's a principle, it needs to be agreed by everybody as member of the G20. So you have to be considerate of the very diverse views and different, development stage level priorities and capacity in different countries. That's why it's a more sort of a labor-intensive process to reach consensus, but it's possible. In fact, the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group produced lots of useful global public goods, such as the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap 2021 and the G20 Transition Finance Framework 2022. It's just a test of how innovative you are in terms of organizing these discussions, and willingness to compromise, and eventually we'll be able to produce something that's usable to guide the global work on green sustainable finance. Let me just give you one example, which the G20, I think, did a good job. It's the endorsement of ISSB to become the global baseline for disclosure. But internationally, we know back a few years ago, there's lots of disclosure principles, frameworks, requirements, and so on. And the proliferation of that is leading to chaos and increase the cost of getting environmental climate data. And we need to consolidate and converge these principles to one. And the G20 became the perfect platform to do that, lifting one of these standards into the global stage and push them become the global standard. Now it's becoming the global standard.
I mean, there's some great observations on the different models, the consensus model, whereas the central policy-driven model, and also the point around ISSB, which is truly becoming the global standard now in terms of adoption. And I wanted to move a little bit over to CASI, which I think is an incredibly exciting initiative, launched in COP28, and had the pleasure of being there at launch and a founding member, the CFA, alongside a number of prestigious organizations. And want to know what really inspired you to establish CASI, and why capacity building is so crucial for sustainable finance in emerging markets and developed economies.
Yeah, as I said, I co-chaired the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group for many years. And during the process, I observed rapid growth of green sustainable finance, but mainly in OECD countries and in China. For example, in China, currently our green loan ratio is 14%, which means that the outstanding green loans are about 14% total outstanding loans. But in many other emerging market economies, it's about 3%. And these are the countries with statistics, with taxonomies. For those without, I think the ratio is even lower. And the funding gap in other emerging markets are huge. For example, in ASEAN countries, some analysis was showing that 80% of the demand for the renewable investment is not met. And that's why in 2023, the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group came up with a TAAP, which is called Technical Assistance Action Plan, calling for strengthened global efforts for capacity building on sustainable finance for emerging markets and developing economies. And they realized that a key bottleneck that's leading to the funding gap is the lack of capacity in setting up the green financial system in terms of taxonomy, disclosure, products, policy incentives, and so on. We need to help them. Instead of having them reinventing the wheel, lots of global best practices can be transferred to them at a much lower cost if we have a platform, such as the CASI. That's why the CASI was launched in response to the G20 call at the end of 2013. At the COP28, the Institute of Finance Sustainability, which I chair, organized the launch of CASI with initially 42 members, and the CFA Institute is one of the founding members of the initial membership. And now we are a network of 67 institutional members. And last year, we trained 5,000 people already from emerging markets, developing countries. And our aim is to train 100,000 green finance specialists by 2030.
It's been an incredible year for CASI in terms of attracting new members, in terms of delivering, in terms of training programs, both online and in-person training programs. The objective of the 100,000 learners was cited as being ambitious by some, but now feels very realistic. How do you know that what you're doing and the quality of your trainings having the impact that you want it to have? What's going to be the measure of the sort of outputs from all of the activities that you're undertaking?
Measurement success is a tricky thing. We can measure in terms of number of participants, which we had, right? 5,000 last year attended our big forums and seminars. And in the future, we'll have more because we are launching the online program that can attract a lot more audience than otherwise. And the other thing is really how the participants responded, what they say and what they want to do after the events. Just to give you a few examples, recently after the Hong Kong event, which we hosted for 20 plus jurisdictions, mainly for Asia, one Malaysian expert attended the Hong Kong event, said to us that they want us to do it again in Malaysia in 2025. And now we are planning for that event, which means that they have a need of similar training. And in Doha, which we hosted, I think the third major event last year, the participants were telling us that they want to co-develop contents with us for future use in Middle East. And in Azerbaijan, which is the fourth big event we organized last year, the university in Azerbaijan was telling us that they want to use online courses for students. And more recently, a lot of banks, which attended our events, said to us that they want us to sort of tailor-make training program using some of online contents for their staff members. So we're visibly seeing demand in the middle and right after these events. That's how we feel the impact.
As the initiative's evolving, what are you hearing consistently around the primary barriers that are preventing really that mobilization of sustainable finance in emerging markets? As you say, there's a gap in knowledge, there is a gap from supply and demand. But when you talk to the leaders, what is it that's really preventing that?
Now, for developing country emerging markets, there are two sets of issues that's considered by us as bottlenecks. One is certainly the lack of infrastructure for financial development. That's something is a longer-term task and has to be addressed at the overall financial system level. And the other set of issues are related to green or sustainability factors. For example, in many emerging markets, they don't have the basic policy frameworks. For example, no taxonomy, which means that they don't have official definition of what green activities are. That's likely to lead to greenwashing if you begin to do green finance without taxonomy. And secondly, they don't have a disclosure requirements in terms of disclosing environmental benefits to demonstrate the projects are green, and the lack of requirement for disclosing ESG information for the entities or fundraisers and so on. And again, these are sort of pitfalls that potentially lead to greenwashing. So we need to help them on setting up these basic elements of a policy framework. And the other feature is that they don't have many service providers. In developed markets, you have lots of service providers, second-party opinion providers, and verifiers, and so on. They can help the issuers or the banks to verify or ensure that the greenness meeting standards. But in developing countries, they don't have that. So they have to pick a more usable way of putting green label on the products. For example, taxonomies, if designed properly, they can actually reduce the burden on service providers. And of course, you have to have some service providers which need to be incubated in these economies. And the other thing is that a lot of emerging markets economies are dominated by SMEs. They don't have many large companies. And SMEs are quite sensitive to data-related cost. You tell them that disclosure is very expensive, they will refuse to do that. And you have to find ways to reduce the cost of organizing data collection, processing data, and transmitting to the users, which are the banks and other investors. And another big issue is bankability. A lot of developing countries, they come up with projects which they believe are green and bankable, but in fact are not bankable. These projects are not making money. And that's why we have to help them to improve the bankability by advising on technology, on the execution team, on the power purchase agreement, and on financing packages and so on. So it's not just one answer to your question, but a combination of many, many bottlenecks that need to be addressed. And CASI is aiming to provide comprehensive package of knowledge and best practice in all these areas.
One of the areas which you talked a bit about is taxonomy, and I know it's an area of focus for you. The taxonomy that sort of was born out of the EU was very complex, very time-consuming for people to adapt, very long in terms of the rules. And how have you made that more accessible to countries that don't simply have that manpower or resource or finance to be able to apply it in the same way?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic, which I spent so many years on. I actually led the drafting of China's first green bond taxonomy in 2015, and that became the world's first official green bond taxonomy. EU had its first taxonomy, I think, 2018-19. it took them 3 years to develop a taxonomy for sustainable finance. And so really about 3-4 years ago, China and EU were the two largest economies with taxonomies. And after that, many other jurisdictions came up with a taxonomy. The EU one, according to developing country standards, are really too complex and too long. It's a 600-page document. The Chinese one is 60-page, so we are 1/10 in terms of length. And EU has many other regulations and rules incorporated into the green bond or green sustainable finance taxonomy. So really, I think we should think through how to use the taxonomies, and it will help you to shape what kind of taxonomy you want. For us in China, we had 4 usage of taxonomy. Number one is preventing greenwashing, which could arise from the lack of taxonomy, right? And secondly, it's used for label financial products. For example, we have green loan taxonomy, green bond taxonomy. Then we can use a taxonomy, put a sticker on the loan and bond. If they are consistent with the taxonomy, we call them green loan, green bonds. And thirdly, we use them as a measurement for performance. For example, the banks will have to report how much green loan you extended based on taxonomy. Then the central bank will evaluate their performance. If you're doing well, means that you have a green loan ratio which is higher than peers, then you will be praised by the central bank. And also, this measurement or reporting of green loan, green bond numbers become a basis for allocating incentives. Some local governments will actually subsidize green loans and green bonds based on taxonomy. So based on these usages, we designed our taxonomy. And so far, I think all these usages are practiced in China. But if you make it too complicated, then some of usage cannot be materializing because it's too complex and too costly, taking too long to label a product if you follow the entire 600-page taxonomy. That's one consideration. And the other thing is, how do we make sure that many other countries don't have to reinvent the wheel? Because taxonomies are essentially, in my view, global public goods. If a few large economies agree on the basic principles of what green sustainability should mean, then many other countries can basically use that as a reference. That's why 4 years ago, between China and Europe, we came up with the idea of producing a common ground taxonomy, which I had the honor to co-chair the working group that produces common ground taxonomy. And more recently, Singapore joined this common ground taxonomy exercise. And at COP29, which is just 2 months ago, we announced the multi-jurisdiction common ground taxonomy, which is called MCGT. That's a version jointly produced or recognized by Europe, China, and Singapore. I think this kind of MCGT can be used as a benchmark or reference for many other jurisdictions to develop or revise their taxonomy. And by doing so, it will enhance interoperability of taxonomies across jurisdictions, and therefore helping facilitate growth, help facilitating green capital flows across jurisdictions.
And in terms of, as a UK citizen, I was really pleased to see the resumption of the China-UK economic financial dialogue on the 11th of January this year. And I think it provides a springboard for greater cooperation and collaboration across green finance between our respective sort of countries. And what do you see as the opportunity for the countries to partner, or even more broadly than just that sort of UK-China relationship, the opportunity for deeper bilateral engagement on these issues at a time when there is more divergent views in the world?
UK-China started collaboration on green finance a long time ago, I think as early as 2015. I remember early 2015, I was visiting the Bank of England to basically lobby them to become partner of the PBOC to co-chair the G20 Green Finance Study Group. This is what we called at that time. Later, it became the working group. And Mark Carney agreed, and we kicked off the collaboration of co-chairing the G20 work between 2016 and 2018. So it's 3 years of a good collaboration between China and UK on G20. And after 2017-18, we began a lot of bilateral initiatives under the China-UK Green Finance Task Force, which I co-chaired initially with Sir Roger Gifford and later on Sir William Russell. And we've done a lot of things under the China-UK Task Force on green investment principles for Belt and Road and dissemination of TCFD, and setting up ESG Leaders Forum. And now we're moving on to new topics such as transition finance and nature financing under the recent EFT agreement. In fact, I'm leading another Chinese delegation to London in the middle of this year, 2025, to resume the dialogue. And indeed, the CASI is a good demonstration of UK-China collaboration, because out of the 67 members of CASI, about 20 of them are actually based in London or having offices in London.
What advice would you give to people who are interested in a career in terms of the intersection of finance and sustainability, both for people early in their careers, but perhaps people who are more mature in their careers who have recognized this sort of opportunity here?
I think for young people, students, or junior staff members in the banking financial industry, really green finance, ESG related opportunities are huge. Just give you my estimate. Currently, in many emerging market economies, green loans are about 3% of total loans, and they should go to 30%. They should increase by 30-fold. Based on trajectory, I can observe already from China and other places. And to give you one example of China's industrial bank, which is the first equator bank in China. Back 10 years ago, they were telling me that they have 200 green finance specialists. And recently, I asked them, how many you want to train? They say they want to train 10,000 green finance specialists within the same bank. This is how massive the demand is for skills and talents in green finance and ESG. And at the company level, I think every large size company will have a team to work on ESG, because ESG disclosure will be mandatory required, and they need to be reported just like accounting. And that's why the number of jobs in this areas is going to increase exponentially going forward.
That's great and very uplifting. Any closing thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with in terms of sustainable finance, the role of capacity building, or anything else you want to add?
Now, in terms of future trends of green sustainable finance, I think the following few areas are just starting, but have a huge potential. One is transition finance. As I noted in many other occasions, green finance so far has been narrowly defined as addressing issues of environmental degradation and carbon emission and so on in the form of green taxonomy, meaning that only those meeting the green taxonomy, we consider them as green, and financing these activities are considered as green finance. So they are fairly narrow. They don't typically include a lot of transition activities, which are in the carbon-intensive sectors or hard-to-abate sectors, such as steel, cement, petrochemical, coal-fired power generation, and so on and so forth. And going forward, a transition finance framework will be set up in many places, and transition finance instruments such as sustainability-linked loans and bonds will be developing very rapidly. The second area is nature financing. We know that the nature financing has a funding gap of 90%, which means that the majority that we need to protect nature, preserve nature, biodiversity are not there yet. And the demand for future private sector participation is massive. And finally, I think the carbon markets that you mentioned is just starting, and the potential is for carbon market to grow like 20-fold in the coming 5 to 10 years.
Thank you, Dr. Ma. It's always a real privilege to speak with you, and I always learn new things each time. And a sort of final point for anybody who is interested, and you've been inspired what Dr. Ma has been saying, I would encourage you to reach out either as individuals or organizations to get involved with CASI. CASI is always open to new members and more support to further its work and promote its activities more broadly. Thank you very much, Dr. Ma. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Paul. Have a good day.